The first time I understood this pattern, it genuinely rattled me, not just an interesting historical fact, but the feeling of cold dread you get when you realize the ground beneath your feet isn't as solid as you thought. It turns out every global reserve currency, every single one of them, has marched through the same 7 stages, not most, not almost all, every single one of them. Portugal, the Dutch Republic, Britain, and now unmistakably the United States. Each believed that it was unique, each thought that it was immune somehow, but the cycle always finished the same way, with collapse. When you look at the data, the timelines, the incentives, you stop wondering if the dollar will follow this path, and you start wondering how much longer it has. Not just because of politics, although that's a significant contributing factor, or who's in the White House, although we all know that's a significant one too. It's not some wild-eyed prophecy, but it is the math itself. And if you don't see it, you're probably not looking closely enough. What I want to show you isn't a doomsday prediction, but rather the anatomy of decay. It's a slow process drawn out over decades that's easy to miss until it spreads up all at once. There are forces that build the dollar's dominance, and right now those same forces are quietly unmaking it piece by piece. So here's what we're going to unpack in this video. First, I will lay out the 7-stage collapse cycle that's already taken down Portugal, the Dutch, and the British empires. The US dollar is well into stage 6 in my view, a phase of decline that's visible if you're willing to really take a look. But this is not just about America's problems. We'll also talk about why China isn't ready to step in and why the next transition won't be smooth or contained, but rather I think it's going to be global, messy, and very unpredictable. Let me ask you something real. If your savings lost half their value tomorrow, what would you actually do? And I mean that literally, not as some distant scenario, but as a personal reality check. Every reserve currency that reached this stage, every single one, saw people's life savings wiped out in the end, often much faster than anyone expected. The only people who protected themselves were the only ones who saw that pattern early and took it very seriously. So leave a comment, I want to hear your answer, because the longer you ignore the cycle, the fewer options you have when it actually finishes. Before we get into all of this, a quick personal note. I've written a book called Awake, the Practice of Critical Thinking in an Age of Self-Lies. It's really about how to stay clear-headed when the world's political and economic stories start to blur the truth. If you've noticed that real clarity feels harder to find these days, I wrote this for you. You'll find the book in the launch video link below. There is also a subscriber discount, so if you're interested, make sure that you subscribe and check out the links for further details. Getting the book is the best way to support the channel as well, and I think you'll get a lot out of it as well. Anyway, you know there's something genuinely haunting about seeing a historical cycle repeat with this much precision. I don't say that lightly. In my view, most things in history don't actually repeat, they just sort of rhyme a little bit. But this pattern with reserve currencies is almost eerily consistent. Just look at the timeline. Portugal, then the Dutch Republic, then Britain, now the US. Each one built overwhelming power, not just in their economies, but in their ability to project force around the world. And with that, each one became the world's reserve currency. When we say reserve currency, we mean the currency that everyone else needs for trade, for settling debts, for holding as a kind of global safety net. But here's the twist that always catches people off guard. In every single case, the decay didn't start with bad leaders or sudden mistakes. It began from within, through incentives that made sense in the short term, but turned out to be fatal over decades. If you're the reserve currency, the world needs your money. So instead of focusing on exporting real goods, things like machinery, technology, food, you start exporting your own money. And for a while, it feels like you've unlocked this cheat code. I think this is where the rot sets in. What looks like ultimate power is actually the start of decline. Because when a country can print its own currency and the world will still take it, it stops having to work as hard to create real value. The result is a slow, comfortable slide into living beyond your means, essentially. This 7-stage collapse cycle is something we really dove into this video that I'm going to link here. And honestly, it's not some abstract theory. It's more like watching the same movie play out again and again with perfect symmetry over hundreds of years. If you lay it out, it kind of goes like this. First, a country controls the trade routes, which is just another way of saying that it dominates global commerce and has the muscle to keep it that way. Then wealth floods in, the golden age. Next, their currency is formally adopted by everyone else, which feels like the peak. But right after that, they start running deficits. Basically, they import more than they export, relying on their privileged status. When that gets too hard to sustain, they start debasing the currency, which just means printing more and more money or making each unit worth less. And eventually confidence erodes and the world starts searching for alternatives, and then the replacement comes in. Now, right now, in my view, the dollar is firmly in stage 6, losing confidence as other countries quietly hedge their bets. Portugal, the Dutch, Britain, they've all played out their turns already, and the US is next in line. And honestly, I think the most dangerous belief any country can have at this point is, well, it can happen to us. That's what every reserve currency has told itself right before the slide became impossible to ignore. When a country earns the status of global reserve currency, it gets what economists call exorbitant privilege. And that's not just a fancy term. It means other countries actually need its currency, not just to buy and sell goods, but to settle international debts, to hold in their central banks as reserves, even to buy things like oil, which is almost always priced in dollars. On the surface, that sounds like the ultimate prize, like you've reached the very top of the economic food chain. But honestly, in my view, it's more like a gilded trap than a throne, because here's what happens next. As more and more countries need your money, it becomes really tempting for your government to just make more of it. You need to pay for a war or a stimulus package or to cover a deficit? No problem. Just add a couple of zeros. It's a very easy human temptation. In the beginning, this feels harmless. Printing money to cover expenses can buy time, sometimes decades. But over time, you stop focusing on making the things the world actually needs, like technology, energy, food, and instead you just get really good at making more money. And sooner or later, people start to notice this. The world stops wanting your money as much because they realize it's being produced faster than any real wealth is actually being created. You see this play out in every reserve currency collapse. Portugal started debasing the real, which means they diluted the silver content in their coins, making each one worth less. The Dutch did something very similar by inflating the guilder. Britain kept devaluing the pound, especially after the world wars. It's always the same playbook. Now the United States is doing the same thing. Since 2008, the US has printed more dollars than in its entire previous history. COVID just put that process into overdrive, but honestly, that trend started well before that as well. This is not just an economic story. I know that it sounds that way, but it's about noticing the incentives and understanding what's really going on behind the scenes. Most people, I think, don't really notice inflation as it's happening because it's slow at first. But those who pay attention, the critical thinkers, see the writing on the wall. They see that once the government gets used to running deficits and can't easily raise taxes or cut spending, the printing press becomes the only option left. And in my view, this is not a political statement, it's just logic. The structure of the system practically guarantees it. Now here's where things get even trickier and honestly a lot more nuanced than most people realize in my view. When I talk about governments printing money, it's important to say that there is a lot of debate about economists about what that really means in practice. First of all, the government doesn't print money, it's going to be the central bank. The technical term for printing money is quantitative easing, or QE. And it's not just running the presses and tossing cash out of helicopters. Sometimes it's about central banks buying government bonds to inject liquidity into the financial system, hoping to spur lending and investment. But the long-term effects of this are still being studied. So in my view, it's worth being cautious because it's not just about blaming villains or reaching for the pitchforks. These are very complicated systems and not every outcome is planned here. As I mentioned quite a bit in my book Awake, certainty is comforting and soothing. It's easy to decide who the villain is, even with inconclusive evidence, because it's just easier on ourselves if we can point to something or someone. But economics, finance, history, the world are all a giant, messy system. And the truth is, most of the time, we don't really have conclusive evidence for a lot of these things. But generally speaking, once a reserve currency starts relying on these policies, something interesting and honestly pretty predictable starts to happen. Other countries, other central banks, begin searching for alternatives, not out of spite, but out of self-preservation. They see the supply of dollars growing, and they start to do the math on what that means for their own reserves. Stage 6, which is where I think we are now, is a period of quiet exit. Central banks begin to trim down their dollar holdings. Countries start to settle more trade in their own local currencies, cutting the dollar out of the process. Even major energy producers like Saudi Arabia have started accepting payments in yuan. It doesn't make the headlines yet, but it matters a huge deal. To give you a sense of scale very quickly, back in the year 2000, around 72% of all officially reported global reserves were held in dollars. Today, that share has dropped to about 58%. While some of this decline is due to growth of other currencies and changes in the exchange rates, it still represents a major shift in the financial landscape, with central banks quietly diversifying away from the dollar on a scale of trillions of dollars, long before any kind of crisis or rush for the exits even exists. This is where the dread really sets in, at least for me, because there isn't a clear replacement waiting in the wings. Unlike previous transitions, when the British pound gave way to the dollar, for example, there's no obvious candidate to take over right now. This is something I dig into in part in this other video that I'm linking here about China. And for a while, a lot of analysts thought that yuan would become the new standard, but now the reality, at least in my view, is that China controls trade, yes, but not the other essentials like open capital flows, broad international trust, or true currency convertibility. The euro, for all of its strengths, is a fragmented system. Gold isn't really used for large-scale trade anymore. It's more like an insurance policy than a global currency. Crypto faces serious barriers from governments, and a basket system like the IMF's special drawing rights is just too slow and too bureaucratic to react in a real crisis. So what happens when the world desperately needs a new anchor and no one is ready or able to provide it? In my view, you get a kind of controlled chaos, multiple currencies at play, fractured trust, each trading bloc looking out for itself, and no single standard for pricing commodities or setting big trades. History shows that this can work, sort of, but never smoothly and never on a scale like we're seeing now. And I think that's worth paying close, very careful attention to, with as clear a head as possible. Now, this is the part that honestly gives me chills. With past reserve currency collapses, the pain was mostly local. When the Portuguese real went down, it devastated Lisbon and Portuguese trade. Unfortunate, but that was the case. The Dutch collapse hollowed out Amsterdam's power. The pound's decline set Britain back for a generation. But with the dollar, the stakes are completely different, because this is not just America's currency we're talking about at this point. The US dollar is basically the operating system of the world's economy. There is a running joke among economists that if the US coughs, everyone catches a cold. The dollar is how oil, wheat, copper, and almost all global commodities are priced. It's the unit for most international debt, with over $70 trillion in bonds denominated in dollars. That means when trust in the dollar cracks, it is not just a few banks or hedge funds that get hit. Entire economies can freeze up almost overnight. Emerging markets, countries that have borrowed in dollars, suddenly can't repay their debts if the value of their dollar spikes or confidence disappears. Corporations that issue dollar bonds can face bankruptcy, not because they made reckless bets, but because the ground rules changed. And central banks that have been holding huge piles of US dollars as reserves may see their safety nets quietly eroded by inflation rather than outright theft. So I don't think that this is just a financial story or even an economic one. What we're really talking about here is a total restructuring of how the world trades, invests, and builds trust. And when things are this interconnected, I think the only real protection isn't found in panic, but in clear thinking. This is where critical thinking genuinely matters. It means not just reacting to headlines, but noticing the deeper patterns, the incentives, the moves that are allowed, the rules everyone is quietly playing by. Collapse becomes almost inevitable, not because of one single decision, but because of how the whole system is set up. And in my view, that's what makes critical thinking more than just a buzzword. It's about understanding the system you're living in before it shifts beneath your feet. Anyway, if you're enjoying this, I'd love it if you subscribe. The House of L is a community of thoughtful, curious people, and you're very welcome here. What really unsettles me about this whole story isn't the speed of the collapse, it's just the eerie symmetry of it all. Portugal's reserve currency era lasted about 80 years. The Dutch got around 80 as well, Britain about 105 years. And then the US dollar took the crown in 1944. It's been about 81 years since then. You don't have to be a historian to feel the pattern breathing down your neck, right? So we're right on schedule, but the difference this time is that it's not just one nation facing the fallout, it's all of us. The dollar isn't just America's business. It's built into the bones of the global economy, from the price of oil to the value of savings in countries most people have never even thought about. When that kind of system starts to wobble, there really isn't anywhere to hide. And here's what's so striking to me. This isn't the kind of crisis you can vote away or avoid by changing your news diet. We're here because of decades of incentives, systems, and decisions that no single leader could have undone. This is about the global logic of the system, something bigger than anyone's preferences or political leanings. So I'll put the question to you again, and this time I really mean it. If your savings lost half their value tomorrow, what would you actually do? Not just react, not just panic, but how would you think? What questions would you start asking? Because in times like these, emotional reactions are everywhere, a dime a dozen. What's rare and what I think is far more valuable is clear critical thought. That's the skill that lets you see beyond the slogans and the panic, lets you recognize patterns while there's still time to adapt. And honestly, that's the whole spirit behind Awake and why I care so much about practicing critical thinking in an age of distortion and noise. This is how reserve currencies end, not with a bang, but through decades of little choices, ignored until they become undeniable. Slow at first, then suddenly, by the time everyone's awake, the transition has already happened. So if this changed the way that you see things, if it nudged you to start thinking more critically about the world, then I'd say you're already doing the one thing that actually makes a difference. The next step is yours. If you're someone who's been thinking about how to make sense of uncertain times, how to think clearly when the world is shifting, I wrote Awake for you. It's a book about learning to recognize the turning points, to build internal steadiness when external signs are loud. I've linked it below if you'd like to explore more. Thank you so much for watching, and if you'd like to explore this kind of topic further, check out these videos that I've linked here as the natural next step. Until next time, stay awake.